with our agenda and minutes parts, and hopefully he'll walk in at any time. So we'll call ourselves to order now. 7. First up is approval of our agenda for the day. We can do that by consensus. Do we have any changes to the agenda necessary? All right, hearing none, we'll approve our agenda as presented. And then we'll have the approval of the May 4th commission minutes. We can take motion second from anyone who was present for that meeting.
So moved.
Second.
Motion from Cecily, a second from Monica. Are there any corrections to those minutes necessary? All right. All in favor of approving the minutes as presented, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the minutes are approved. So then I guess you can go ahead and grab them. That will bring us to the public invitation portion of our meeting, and I understand we do have a couple of people waiting right outside that have pre-registered for that, so Emmett's going to fetch them at this time.
I didn't give you obstructive view on purpose, because you've got these pillars.
Welcome. So this will now be the time on our agenda where we welcome public comment for things that are not on the agenda. And I do have 3 people pre-registered to speak. I'll call your name in the order I have on the sheet from staff here. And you're invited to come up to the table where the microphone is to make your comments. When you speak, please state your name for the record, along with your place of residence and the organization you represent, if any. And when you're finished, you're welcome to either stay for the remainder of our meeting or you can leave. Either way, it's up to you. We will ask you to limit your remarks to 3 minutes or less each, so try not to be repetitious of each other. So first up, I have Tom Darling. You can go ahead and approach the table.
Hello. I hope you didn't get caught in the rain as much as I did. Thanks. My name's Tom Darling. Hello. And I live in St. Paul, live on Summit Avenue. I am the president of the Summit Avenue Residential Preservation Association, SARPA. And I'm here talking individually, not as, I don't want the extra 2 minutes. So anyhow, I'm here to give you a bit of a preview about some of the issues that I believe are going to come up when you are asked to approve the Summit Avenue Regional Trail Plan, which I don't know when that will be, but it won't be tonight. But it's coming, and it's important. And there is a lot of information that you folks, I believe, need to be aware of before you vote. And I'm going to start by inviting you to contact SARPA, Summit Avenue Residential Preservation Association. We've got a website and we've got an email address. Just send an email and say, hey, I'd like some information. I'll eventually get it, like quite quickly, I will get it. And I would love to set up a telephone call meeting or with you all individually if you're interested. I did that with the Parks and Recreation Commission at the city and talked to three or four of those members, and they each said it was very useful. So please take me up on that. There is a lot of information that you will not get from the written documentation that will be presented to you. Second, and this is, I don't know if I even should say this, but I will. You have a very important role, and it is not a check the box role. It is to determine many things, but among them is this a feasible plan? And feasible is not possible. I mean, it needs to be a determination that you all make. I don't believe, and Emmett perhaps will disagree, but I'm sure he's had people disagree with him before. It's not that you all are going to be asked to check a box that says, the city of St. Paul says it's feasible. No, you have an affirmative role, I believe, and I want you to, I know you wouldn't be doing this if you didn't take it seriously, but please, this is an extremely serious matter you're going to be asked to deal with. And this is something that is, I think, unusual.
If you could wrap it up, Tom.
Okay. I would like you folks to invite SARPA or the SOS group to make a presentation to you when you are called upon to determine or decide on this trail. The city will make a presentation, at least that was my observation, in January. Let us have 15 minutes after that. I guarantee you, you will learn a lot that you wouldn't learn just from the city's presentation. So sorry for going over. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you. And then next we have Robert Katnack. Let's know if that's how it is.
Would you mind if we swap?
Oh, that's fine. The other name I had is Bridget Ailes.
That's it.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's pronounced Alice.
You got it.
I just
Well, I'm
learned
an old
that.
friend with Emmett here. I know. Well, thank you. My name is Bridget Alice, and I'm in, hello to you. I live in St. Paul, and I'm also here regarding the Summit Avenue Regional Trail and concerned citizen. And one piece that I've really looked at is your classification system for local and regional park facilities. And for the regional linking trail, it seems like I'm just concerned that it's not respecting the natural resource base. It says that if a regional linking trail placement that they are seeking in terms of the off-road, if it is done appropriate, on-road trails are appropriate. Maybe the off-road trail is appropriate, maybe it's not, but what I'm here to seek is some expert opinion from bicycle trail designers. In my meetings with the city, and I was on the design advisory committee, I went to the meetings, I was the alternate to our person from Summit Hill in case they couldn't go. But so I was there at all of them. And one thing I appreciated, the fact that it was evident in the sense that it was released information that this is really the first kind of trail that has ever been built like this through such a highly dense residential area. So I just think that calls for potentially like a nationwide search, maybe for some experts on building those kinds of trails. Not to say that the folks from Landscape Architect from the city of St. Paul aren't wonderful people, all that kind of stuff. I mean, they have done great stuff. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that this seems like it's kind of an experiment, a potentially a very radical experiment, and maybe it will be great, maybe not. That's all I'm saying. So that's what I would invite. Expert testimony from a bicycle, I don't even know what you call them. Trail experts. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bridget.
Thank you.
Thanks, good afternoon. Get my watch out here. My name's Bob Katnack. I'm a Summit Avenue resident. I'm a pretty dedicated cyclist. Anthony let me go on one of the slow roll rides with him. I can keep up. This has been very controversial. You all know that. My request is not necessarily to pick a side, but I want to talk about process because that's the hard part for me. A lot of what I do is process oriented. And the process here, frankly, hasn't worked that well. And the reason that's really important at this stage is this is the last time any government entity is going to vote on this in that council. There will be no other votes. There will be a master plan approved, but after that it's ministerial. It's done. It's set in concrete. It can't go back. So when this process is concluded, it's done. And I obviously have concerns about the irreversible nature of what's happening. Once you cut those trees down, you move those curb lines, you can't put them back. This isn't Bryant Avenue. That was unfortunately what happened there. But they could kind of fix it by putting in another bulldozer. We'll move that out, put it back in. You can't do that in Summit Avenue. And there's a couple things I wanted to mention in particular that, that I would ask you to consider. In addition to the expert, which is really important, and they're called bicycle facility experts. There's probably half a dozen of them in the country. Not one was consulted. And we think that's a big deal because Summit is not a one-size-fits-all. There's different parts of it. And what works well in one part may not work well in another. All we're asking is get an expert to say, here's what works, here's what doesn't work. And then, do what you will. The other two pieces I want to mention very briefly is the process deficiencies. As you may have heard or seen, we did ask for some documents under the Data Practices Act. Ramsey County judge said they were in violation of that act. They still haven't produced all the documents. The legality of what City Council did is open question. We don't want to have to go back and redo this. Let's get it done right. And so my ask on process is, let's get the documents produced so everybody has a full and same opportunity to comment. And two, apropos of the last vote, there's been no environmental review, no historical review, and they'll say, oh, that's coming. There is no final agency action left after this. It won't, they can do it, but it won't matter because it's baked in. So there's some important process points. We hope you'll consider them, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today.
Thank you. Does staff at this time have any idea of timeline for when we might be seeing anything about this?
After the city council vote, I don't know if it was last week or the week before.
It was last week.
Last week, thank you. Yeah, time is just either speeding up or slowing down, but St. Paul has submitted their final plan, and it will be, we're scheduling it. It's been deemed complete, and so we're scheduling it for the next meeting of this commission, which will be July 13th. It's a special meeting because July 4th falls on, or July 6th, our meeting date falls 2 days after the 4th, so thinking it would be better to meet a little later. It will be coming to the Community Development Committee meeting then, to their first meeting in August, which is August 7th, and then it'll be coming to the second August Metropolitan Council meeting, which is August 23rd.
Okay. But key for anybody in the room here, if we wanted to do further research into it, we want to do it before July.
Exactly.
Cool. All right. Yes.
I would like to take them up on their opportunity to present at our meeting as to Western. Is it SARPA?
SARPA, yes.
SARPA.
We'll chat.
Yeah, okay, we'll talk.
Okay. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
So much.
And I'm sure for more. That then brings us into the business item for today, which is the annual Metropolitan Regional Parks Operation and Maintenance Allocation. We have Aimee presenting. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
All right, good afternoon, Chair, Council Member, and Commissioners. My name is Aimee Junget. I am a budget analyst for community development. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and you can feel free to call me Aimee. This afternoon, I'm presenting the annual funding allocation for Metropolitan Regional Parks Operation and Maintenance, known for short as O&M. So what is operations and maintenance? Minnesota Statute 473351 requires that by July 15th of each year, the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission reports to the Council the funding requests from the implementing agencies based on the actual expenditures made in the previous year. The state legislature funds a portion of the expenses necessary to run the regional park system because the system draws a significant percentage of its visits from outside the metropolitan area and the state of Minnesota. The law requires the Council to review the operating expenses of each agency for eligibility on an annual basis. So state statute provides the formula for the distribution. The formula is based on 3 inputs. 40% is based on the previous year's operating and maintenance expenditures. 40% is based on the previous year's proportionate share of total system visits. And then finally, 20% is based on the previous year's proportionate share of total acreage for each agency. Oh, sorry, I'm behind here. There we go. So this year's analysis programmed $17.49 million appropriated by the legislature for state fiscal year 2024. This includes $8.54 million from the state general fund and $8.95 million from the lottery in lieu of sales tax revenue. One important note here is that these appropriations are the result of a successful 2023 legislative session outcome for Parks O&M with a one-time general fund increase of $6 million for state fiscal year 2024 and an increase to the lottery in lieu portion of an additional $1.5 million. So if you look at the table, you can see on the left, expenses reported by each agency are totaling over $129 million. And then on the right, the shares totaling $17.49 million of that appropriation from the state. And lastly, the inputs for these shares are final. So just to summarize the funding here, we have $8.54 million from the state general fund and an estimated $8.95 million lottery in lieu of sales tax revenue. And these final pass-through amounts will be based on the actual revenues received for state fiscal year 2024. So the recommended action here is that the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission reports to the Metropolitan Council the Regional Park System State Fiscal Year 2024 Operations and Maintenance Funding requests. And with that, I can answer any questions.
All right. Questions, commissioners? I think the last time I talked to Emmett about this, he wasn't quite sure numbers would all be final by today, but they are.
These are final. Yep, we were able to get all the inputs finalized. So these are final shares for O&M.
And the last couple of years, we had done this with calculations without fully current visitor data because of the pandemic, and that is now all caught up as well, right? Yeah, you say yes. Okay, that's not my job. Okay. Welcome, Bob.
Good morning.
All right. We'll let Bob get settled. Bob, you can check your packet if you wish. We are currently on our one business item for the day, talking about the O&M allocations.
Thank you.
Do you have any questions for staff about that item?
I do not.
Okay.
The $6 million one-time allocation from the legislature is a big deal, and 1.5 ongoing annually is a big deal. I just wanted to underline that as Bob got settled.
And
So we are happy with this?
yeah, some good stuff happens.
Because I just see 120 million and we just get 17.
Well,
I will not be happy.
we're not at what
You're
we would
smarter than
like
me.
to see, but we are better than what we historically have.
All right.
Theoretically,
13.5%.
yeah. Theoretically, we're supposed to be getting at least 40% of that big number. You just calculated it's 13.5. The last several years, it's been between 7 and 9. So it's not 40, but it's more than 9.
All right.
That's an
Was-
important
I'm a
note.
pragmatist.
I know there was this special allocation for either elm or ash trees. Is that included in general O&M or is that a separate thing?
Separate.
Separate. Okay,
And did we got that one or we don't know yet?
we did. We'll cover that.
Got it, yeah.
That's
Wasn't that-
the scary one.
Does anyone wish to make motions on this?
I'll make a motion to present this to the city council as it is. That's how the motion goes?
Yeah,
Something like that.
I'll read it after someone seconds it. Do we have a second? Second. So motion from Monica, second from Anthony for what was the proposed action in the business item from staff, which is that the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission reports to the Metropolitan Council the Regional Park System State Fiscal Year 2024 Operations and Maintenance Funding requests. And yes, on this one, we don't actually approve anything per se. We approve the report saying, yes, we see some numbers, we believe they're correct. This seems fine, and send that off to council. Any further discussion? All in favor of that, say aye. Aye. All opposed? Okay, that report is approved. Thank you. in the bulk of our stuff today, we have some information items, starting with the Parks and Trails Legacy funded Streetlight Research Project. We have findings and summary from Raven and Ellen. Go ahead, let us know who you are and what you want to tell us about.
Chair Commissioners, my name is Raven McKnight. I'm a data scientist on the Community Development Research Team, and I'm really excited to be here today to share some key findings and resources from this 2-year-long shared legacy research project. As you may or may not already know, this has been a 2-year-long research project, which began at the beginning of June 2021, meaning it's wrapping up at the beginning of June 2023, i.e. this week and next week. So the work I'm presenting today is essentially a finished project, and we're really just going in and kind of crossing our last T's and dotting our last I's over the next couple of days. A quick agenda for today. I'll go over some background about this project and then spend most of our time talking about some really high-level key findings about parks, about trails, and then about visitors to parks and trails. Our conversation today will be pretty high level, but this comes at a nice time because I believe on Monday we'll be ready to publish all of these sort of final research products from this work, so you'll be able to dive in a lot more detail if anything from this presentation is interesting. With that in mind, I'll direct you all to some of those final research products at the end of the presentation and then hopefully have some time for discussion. So jumping in with some project background, as I mentioned, this has been a 2-year-long project funded by the Minnesota Legacy Parks and Trails Fund, specifically under the Coordinate Among Partners pillar of that fund. And having worked on this project for the past 2 years, one of my key takeaways has definitely been that the collaborative aspect of this work was really, really valuable. You can see here that this was a collaborative effort with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, who works with the state parks and trails, the Greater Minnesota Regional Parks and Trails Commission, who works with regional parks and trails outside of the Twin Cities, and then, of course, the Met Council. And I think because we were pushed to develop methods that would work just as well for the largest, most rural state trails and parks as the smallest, most urban regional parks and trails, we developed much more robust methods and learned a lot more than we might have had this not been a collaborative effort. At a really high level, the goal of this work was to determine whether or not location-based services, or LBS data, would be a useful tool for park and trail research. And I'll define LBS data on the next slide, but here I'd just like to highlight that this was a very exploratory research project, and when it kicked off, we really did not know what sorts of results we would be able to get. There are some other researchers who have used similar data for similar questions, but really not on this scale, where across these 3 systems, we were analyzing about 204 parks and 175 trails. And one of our primary goals and a primary deliverable of this work was to produce park and trail level use estimates. So really, we're working with a significant amount of data and detail here. I think it's important to know a little bit about LBS data before looking at any of these results. So if you've heard this project referenced over the past couple of years, you probably heard it called the Streetlight project, which I think has proven to be a little bit of a confusing title. Because Streetlight data was just our data vendor. So Streetlight is really a brand name for location-based services data. And location-based services, or LBS data, more broadly, is just data generated or derived from smartphones with opt-in GPS services enabled. So I think we can all imagine there's lots of different types of apps that might use GPS services on smartphones, both the more obvious things like Google Maps and navigation services, but also things like fitness trackers or social media. So GPS can be used to kind of improve the user experience on lots of different apps, and users always have the opportunity to opt out. But once a device has been opted into these GPS services, these devices are generating a ton of spatial data just by moving around and interacting with the world. So Streetlight gathers some anonymized GPS data from these sorts of devices, and then really the service they provide to us is they do a lot of data cleaning and processing and modeling to generate these clean data sources that we can use for this kind of analysis. The keywords here really are aggregated and anonymized. So this data is very highly summarized and it's anonymized at many, many steps along the process. So data privacy is really inherently baked into this data product, and we could never use it to identify an individual. It's really meant to be used to analyze broad patterns of travel, which is how we're using it in this work. A couple of the really big benefits we found with LBS data are that we don't have to do any in-field work because the data is being generated continuously as devices move around, so we don't have to go into parks and trails to get this data. And similarly, we can get a lot of spatial and temporal detail in our results because the data is being generated continuously. And we'll see some of that detail in today's presentation. Just to give you a sense of the level of detail we can get, I want to go over what exactly we can measure with LBS data. And one thing that I do think is important to note when we're thinking about the metropolitan region in particular is that the definitions we're using in this project don't 100% align with the definitions we use in our traditional use estimates. Just because these data sources are so vastly different, there are some sort of inherent definitional differences in how we can actually measure park use and trail use. So if you see numbers on the slides today that don't quite match our traditional use estimates, it's because we are just working with slightly different definitions. That said, with the data in this project, we're getting estimated weekly visits to parks, and that includes bicyclists, pedestrians, and people who arrive on vehicles. And then for trails, we're estimating monthly miles of use. So how many miles are bicyclists and pedestrians actually traveling on our parks, on our trails? We'll talk about this in the second half of the presentation, but Streetlight also gives us some inferred visitor home locations and demographics, so we can think about who visitors are. And altogether, we are getting use estimates for January of 2019 through April of 2022 at that weekly or monthly time step. So lots of detail. There are a lot of different ways we can kind of summarize this data and lots of different detail that we can dive into, but for the sake of today's conversation, I'm going to start with kind of the broadest possible summary we can look at, which is our annual use estimates. So that's what we have here. On the left of this slide, we have our annual park use estimates in millions of visitors. So we have 3 bars there in the blue for 2019, 20, and 2021. And then on the right in green are our annual use estimates for trails in millions of miles traveled. And altogether, this is an average of about 34 park visits and 57 miles of trail use per 7-county resident. And although those won't actually be equally distributed across the population quite like that, I think those are very impressive numbers and give us a sense of how much value parks and trails really are providing to the region. One thing you might notice right away is that there's a pretty significant increase from 2019 to 2020 at parks, but especially at trails, which was largely due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But despite that sort of unusual year in between, we see 2021 use is up over 2019 at both parks and trails, which is always good news. From here, there's a lot of different ways we could zoom in to look at a single park, a single trail, a single month or week. But for the sake of time, I'm going to just sort of talk through some of the high-level findings that we have about parks and trails. So thinking first about parks, one of our first findings in this work chronologically was that COVID-19 affected individual parks really differently. This work kicked off in June of 2021, and I think at that time, a lot of us expected to see this huge sort of universal increase in park visitation in the spring and summer of 2020. And that certainly did happen at some parks, but it really was not universal. So this picture on the left is from inside the Como Conservatory, and you might recall that the zoo and conservatory actually had to close completely in March of 2020 when the stay-at-home order was announced. So this is an example of a park that lost the majority of its visitation in 2020. And this is a fairly extreme example, but we saw lots of other parks that stayed open but had to close, a nature center or a swimming beach or some other facility. So we don't see a very universal pattern in response to COVID-19. So this example is specific to what happened in 2020, but I think the finding is a lot broader. And the finding is just that there is so much variation from park to park and trail to trail that the kind of unit level data we got in this research is really valuable when it is available. A few other sort of summary high-level takeaways about parks. We found that statewide, most visitors arrive around noon or shortly after work, in that sort of 5 to 7 p.m. time frame on weekdays. And that after-work peak is very specific to regional parks. We don't really see that happening at state parks, which get most of their visitation around noon or 1, even during the week. So regional parks here and across the state are getting that kind of after-work bump, which I think reflects our intuition about how people use state versus regional parks differently. In the metro area, we found that about 58% of park visitors arrive by vehicle. Of the rest, it's about 35% pedestrian and 7% bicycle. And this was also fairly specific to regional parks. State parks tend to have closer to 80 or 90% of people arriving in vehicles, and then it's really the most walkable areas that have these much higher percentages of people arriving on foot or bike. Before we look at trails, I did want to look at one example of how detailed we can really get with this data. So I want to look at this week-level data for Como Zoo and Conservatory. So this is a time series of our use estimates to Como Zoo and Conservatory for 2020. So on the x-axis is time in weeks from January to December of 2020. And if we start on the left of the figure, in January and February, we see use kind of starting to pick up as people are probably just anticipating warm weather. I doubt it was really warming up at that point. And in that first week of March, we see a really big peak in visitation. And then it was this week that the stay-at-home order was announced in Minnesota. So we can see very clearly the week where things started to change, and visitation drops almost to 0. The zoo and conservatory stayed closed for a couple of months before the conservatory only reopened on a reservation basis during this week. We see a little bump in visitation there, and then about a month later in July, the zoo reopened, and that's when we see a more significant increase in visitation. So this is an example I've used a lot of times over the course of this project because I think the narrative is just so clear in this time series, but we see much smaller events also popping up in the weekly data, things like a week-long hockey tournament or a day-long marathon or 10K will also pop up as one week with much higher visitation than usual. So I think that gives a sense of how much nuance this data can really convey at individual parks and trails. Zooming back out to think about some big picture things about trails. As you might have noticed on that first slide, trails had a much larger sort of COVID effect than parks. And that could be for several reasons, but I think it largely comes down to social distancing. You know, we didn't really have many examples of trails that had to close amenities. And in fact, we have a lot of counterexamples of places like the Minneapolis chain of lakes where roads were closed to allow more people to use trails safely. So we see sort of a more universal response to COVID in trails. In the metro area, we found that bikes make up the majority of trail use. About 60% of all trail miles traveled were bike miles. So not a huge majority, and we do find that pedestrians have a larger share in certain cases, specifically during the winter and in very walkable areas. So walkable areas is fairly self-explanatory, but this was particularly true in sort of residential areas and downtowns where lots of people are already out and about walking. And then in the winter, I think it comes down to the fact that not all trails are maintained for winter use, and we know that there's a lot of long recreational bike trips that happen in the summer that just don't continue throughout the winter. So pedestrians make up a larger share. We also found at individual trails, we found some trails that are very busy shortly before 9 a.m. and again shortly after 5 p.m., which we think is interesting because it suggests that those trails might be being used for commuting. So we have some evidence from this data that trails, of course, are important for recreation and exercise and leisure, but also for transportation in some settings. And we saw that pattern across the whole state, but I do think it was most common in metropolitan regional trails just because the trails here are more likely to pass through both residential areas and places where people work. So there's a lot of different ways that we could break this data down more, lots of different things we can say about parks and trails, but I want to switch now to think a little bit about who visitors to parks and trails are. A lot of this work was spent developing these use estimates, and then once we have them, we were naturally really interested in who those visitors are. And luckily, Streetlight gives us 2 different pieces of data we can use to think about this question. The first thing we can look at is where visitors actually live. So Streetlight infers some home locations based on that anonymous GPS data I mentioned earlier. And that's what we're looking at on this map. So this is a map of Minnesota by county, and the darker the county is colored in, the more visitors we infer to live in that county. And this is just for the Metropolitan Regional Park and Trail System during summer 2021. So not super surprising, we see the 7-county metro area and the directly adjacent counties popping out as the most common home locations, but we did detect visitation from all 87 Minnesota counties during the summer of 2021. And we found that about 21% of visitors live in a different county than the park they're visiting. So that could be someone who lives in Hennepin County going to visit a park in Carver County or any such county crossing. So we see some evidence of that regional rather than just a local draw. And in fact, during the summer of 2021, we found that about 7.5% of visitors to regional parks and trails in this region came from out of the state, with Wisconsin being the most common non-Minnesota home location. But we see a decent number of visitors coming from places like California, Texas, Florida, and all 48 of the lower United States were represented, which I think is particularly impressive, again, considering that this is summer of 2021 when travel was still not quite what it once was. I think this data is interesting when we summarize it at the sort of metro regional system level, but it's a lot more interesting if we zoom into a single park or trail. So I'm going to give us one example of what this data looks like at one park, and I'm using Theodore Wirth Regional Park as an example. This data is at zip code level, and this is inferred home locations of visitors to Theodore Wirth. On the left is a map of the whole state, and then on the right, I've just zoomed into the 7-county metro, and you can see Theodore Wirth's location in the little yellow point there. And we see that visitors are very tightly clustered around Theodore Wirth in Minneapolis, but the whole 7-county metro area is fairly well represented, and we even see some zip codes outside of the metro area popping out as common home locations. So I So I think this data is already really interesting on its own because it can tell us a little bit about how local versus regional versus statewide a specific park's draw is. But it can also go a step further, and once we know a little bit about where people live, we can make some more inferences about who those visitors actually are. So in addition to these inferred home locations, Streetlight provides some inferred demographics. And these are demographics they infer by combining those home locations with data from the 2020 US Census. And again, they do a lot of the modeling and data cleaning and statistical analysis on their end to generate these estimates. This table shows the data that we actually have from Streetlight. So we have some inferred data about race and ethnicity, about household income, and about educational attainment. I do think it's important to note whenever we present this data that this inferred data is very different than the type of demographic data we would get from an intercept survey, for example. We would naturally have more confidence in demographics collected by speaking to people face-to-face and learning about their identities and experiences, and we know that this inferred data really can't get at that side of things at all. But we also know that we often don't have that kind of detailed survey data available for a single park or trail. So we think that this inferred data can still be useful to sort of fill in those gaps. That said, this data does also really need to be considered at the individual park or trail level to be meaningful. When we summarize demographics across the whole 7-county metro area or across the whole state, it doesn't really help us learn much about parks and trails. Because context is really critical for analyzing this kind of data, we know that demographics vary a lot across the state, so we don't necessarily expect to see the same patterns at each park and each trail. So in a lot of ways, we do feel like the best next step for the demographic component of this analysis is to hand this detailed data off to people who are experts about individual parks and trails so that they can kind of use that context to evaluate this data in a reasonable way. That said, over the course of these 2 years, we have heard that equity analysis is a big priority for some of our partners. So I do want to walk through an example of what this data sort of looks like at a single park and how you might sort of approach analyzing this. So I'm going to use Theodore Wirth as our example again, just because we were looking at those home locations earlier. And if we're thinking about an equity analysis, we might broadly be asking the question, is visitation to Theodore Wirth equitable? And right away, that's kind of a big question. You have to define what equitable visitation looks like. And there's lots of different ways you might do that. But one way you might define equitable visitation is with the idea of sort of proportional representativeness or representation. So are visitors to Theodore Wirth Regional Park representative of the region? And that's what this figure on the left is sort of trying to explore. So along the y-axis on this figure, you have those census categories for race and ethnicity, and then along the x-axis are percentages. There's 4 populations on this figure. So the gray bars represent the 7-county metropolitan area population. Blue bars are Hennepin County. Green bars are Minneapolis. And then the points are our estimates of Theodore Wirth's visitors during the summer of 2021. This table on the bottom right is just pulling out some of these specific values to make this a little bit easier to look at. And I think it's easiest if we focus on just one category. So I'm focusing on that third set of bars, which represent the Black population. We see based on the 2020 census that about 10% of the 7-county metro area is Black, 13% of Hennepin County, and 19% of Minneapolis. Based on our estimates, we're estimating about 12.5% Black visitors to Theodore Wirth during the summer of 2021. And this is where I think it becomes fairly clear that we need expert knowledge and local context about this park to really proceed with this analysis. Because if we compare Theodore Wirth's visitors to the 7-county or to Hennepin, that might look like proportional representation. We have 12.5% Black visitors in a 13% Black county. That's one very distinct narrative. But when we were looking at that home location map, we saw that visitors were really tightly clustered around Theodore Wirth right in Minneapolis. And if we compare 12.5% Black visitors to a 19% Black city, that's a very different narrative. We have this gap starting to appear, which might indicate barriers to access for this specific park. And if you're familiar with Theodore Wirth, you might know that there are, in fact, there's like not many formal entrances into this park from the north side. So local context might really change the way we interpret this data. I think the idea of choosing the right sort of comparison population is also really clear if you think about the differences between a state versus regional park, where it's sort of in the name. We expect a state park to draw visitors from the whole state, and a regional park to draw visitors from some less well-defined region. So the goal of this slide is not to answer this question, is visitation to Theodore Wirth equitable? I just want to illustrate sort of where you might make where you might start with this kind of analysis and why you really do need to zoom in to think about it at a single park or trail. I know that was a very high-level overview of a lot of things, and this last slide is really more questions than answers, but I do just want to wrap up with some information about the resources we're sharing, hopefully on Monday. So this whole project will be sort of compiled in a project website where you'll be able to download all of the data I mentioned today. It will include all of our written documentation, both sort of high-level summaries and then 100 pages of technical documentation if you're into that level of detail. There'll be lots of interactive visualizations as well as some summaries for each individual park and trail and some webinar recordings for a series of webinars we did last week. I have here on the left just a screenshot of the website just to give you a sense of what that'll look like. I know it's really too small to read, but each of those images is going to link to a separate digital report, which will include those interactives and all of our summarized key findings. And then this is really too small to read on this slide, but one of our deliverables that I think has been really helpful are these one-page sort of infographics for each park and trail that summarize all of the data we have for that unit. I think these have been super interesting to peruse as someone who's not already familiar with all 400 parks and trails. And I think they're helpful for starting to kind of answer these questions about individual parks or trails that you're interested in. So with that, thank you all, and I'd be happy to take any questions or discussion.
Okay. I want to start. When you were talking about the inferred demographics and their usefulness for equity analysis, I'm wondering what you can tell us about how reliable the inferences are in that context. My particular concern is I'm assuming they're looking by the inferred home locations and then making judgments based on that. But if we're saying that we believe our park use doesn't match populations generally, does it then also become true that our park use doesn't necessarily match the population of like their home zip code, and so we don't totally know what that means either?
Yeah, that's a great question, and unfortunately kind of a complicated answer. One downside, I guess, of Streetlight is that their methods are proprietary, so I can't tell you like exactly how they make their inferences. We know that that is a potential issue with any kind of inferred demographic data based on home locations. If 50% of the zip code is Black, but the visitors we're getting from that zip code are the other 50%, we're kind of missing that. I will say we validated this data against some data from the 2021 visitor study. There were 8 parks and 2 trails that were oversampled, so additional surveys were conducted at those units in part so that we had enough data to feel really confident about the demographics out of those 10 units. And we validated this LBS demographic data against that data with a lot of success. I would say there were a few sort of nuanced differences, but there weren't many like significant differences between the surveyed and inferred demographics. So we think that they are getting the patterns correct. Places like Phelan Regional Park, which we know is in like a predominantly Asian community, pops up as having more Asian visitors than any other park in our project sample. So we can tell that they're moving in the right direction, sort of, but there are a lot of kind of caveats to using inferred demographic data, which is part of why we think it's really important to only analyze it if you're familiar with the park or trail, so you can kind of apply logic and context to this analysis.
But it is possible for us to get enough data from our intercept surveys to kind of find out how far off we are.
Yeah. And that will all be included in the technical documentation. I am having a hard time remembering if it's in the higher level summaries. I think there's a reference to it in the high level summaries, and then it'll all be available if you want to really dig into the details. But yeah, we can sort of quantify how similar this data is to the survey data.
Okay. Cecily.
I have 3 questions. So on one of the slides, it said that the definitions are different with LBS. So in an annualized basis, does the visitation in each of the implementing agencies change with this data? Or is it pretty similar?
Yeah, I haven't looked at agency level breakdowns in super recently. I will say we're overall estimating less visitation because of the definitional differences. So there are some things that we're not capturing, like campers. We can't count if someone is in the park for 1 hour or a week. So we're missing some things like that. I haven't looked at sort of a proportional breakdown by implementing agency recently enough to really answer that, but I can make sure that that is in our documentation.
Yeah, and the reason I asked that is in an earlier presentation, one of the percentages in how they get the O&M money is based on visitation. So, you know, if this data is showing a very different story, they may or not benefit. So my second question is, on the out-of-state visitors, are these snowbirds? I mean, you mentioned California and Florida and Texas. It could be people with a second residence.
Yeah, so there's a couple pieces to that answer. The inferred home locations are inferred on a monthly basis. So if somebody lives in Minnesota for 6 months and Florida for 6 months, if they're living in Minnesota while they're visiting parks in Minnesota, they would be counted as an in-state resident. I think, honestly, the main reason that California, Texas, Florida pop out is just because they have a larger population. I think it's mostly just because those are the biggest states, so they have the most people who might end up here.
It's your classic, every map is a map of population.
Yeah, yes.
Right. So my third question is, and this is great. You know, this is a great opportunity for us to look at visitation in different ways, but because a lot of this time period for the study was during the pandemic, is there an opportunity to do it again? You know, maybe wait a certain number of years and do it again and see if things have changed.
Yeah, another great question. At this point in time, we're kind of considering this a snapshot in time project. There have been some changes to the data provider, which means that this data source is changing a little bit, so we're not exactly sure what the future of this data is going to look like. So it kind of comes at a good time that we're already naturally wrapping this project up, because I think this is a good time to pause and kind of dig into the details of this data a little bit more. But yeah, it certainly would be interesting to come back and do this in 3 years when we don't have a very strange year in the middle of the data set.
Yeah, and part of that is I was wondering how repeatable this kind of thing would be if we wanted to use data for stuff every year. Would we be able to do that when we're potentially subject to changes from the vendor or potentially changing which vendor we're using? I'm not a data scientist. Are there ways that you can apply data magic to make things somehow match up such that we could repeatably use the same stuff for one purpose every year?
Yeah, before these recent data changes, I would have said, yes, probably we can do some data magic. Right now, it's not so much, just because there have been some industry-wide changes. So it's not a change with Streetlight Data Inc. It's a change with location-based services data and the availability of that data source. And I mean, I'm not an expert in that. Like, I don't work with Streetlight.
So this particular change is more akin to several years ago now, we had a change of methodology, I don't know the specifics, in how we did our regular visitor survey within the council, and just said, this year to this year are not comparable, look at this, but don't compare them. So it's just sort of a break point, but like, we don't necessarily expect the same kind of change again next year kind of deal.
Yeah, I would say this is definitely a break point. I think in the future, it's likely that we could get this same kind of data for vehicles. It's less clear if we'll be able to get the same kind of data for bicycles and pedestrians in the future, which is unfortunate because we know, especially here in the metro area, bikes and pedestrians make up a lot of park visitors and all trail users essentially. So yeah, I wish I could say more, but until we know more about how this all shakes out, I'm not really sure.
And is that like a regulatory thing in response to privacy concerns, or?
I believe so. Again, I don't 100% know, but I do believe there have been some like nationwide changes to how things like cookies and privacy trackers are being managed, which have changed the amount of LBS data that's available and made it harder for Streetlight to create viable estimates, essentially.
You had something to add, Emmett?
I just wanted to add to Cecily's question about conducting this, during the pandemic. Like, I think that's a really good question, and also relevant to our visitor study, which is we do about every 5 years. And that study creates the multipliers that we use embedded in those funding formulas. So we're gonna hustle up and try to get another visitor study done in 2025. So that we can use, so that the multipliers don't hang around too long if they did get impacted by the pandemic, which, they probably did.
Maybe, I was gonna ask, don't we know if they were affected, the multiplier?
I think we know that they were affected.
We don't know what the numbers are, what we know that they're gonna be.
Yeah, we know that, you just have that.
Yeah, and
We
some
know
of the
they were
agencies
affected.
benefited and some of the agencies
Right.
didn't. As Raven said, the pandemic affected different parks and trails
Right,
differently, so.
And that, so with Streetlight, is it always cellular tower, in-car GPS, in-vehicle GPS, location-based services, and Adler work, that's always aggregated? Or do we have the ability to choose within that?
Sorry, can we decide if we're getting data from cell phones versus in-car
Yeah,
GPS?
can you choose which one, or is it always?
It's always aggregated. Within Streetlight, we can decide which modes of travel were being reported. So we can disaggregate bike, pedestrian, personal vehicle, truck, and bus, I believe. We didn't use commercial trucks, obviously, in this project. But I think that does change which data sources. But for our purposes, it's all aggregated together.
So it's kind of like whenever I park my car, I've gone from going 30 miles an hour to stopped. My phone says, here's where you parked your car, because it knows I probably wasn't walking 30 miles an hour.
Yeah, exactly. The speed is a big part of how they determine if you're walking or biking or driving.
So to add on to that, so what did you do about parks and trails that don't have cell towers or GPS?
That's a great question. This is something we worked on a lot more at the very beginning of this work. First, we talked to Streetlight's data team a lot to confirm that it's only reliant on GPS service. So you don't need to have cell service for your phone to be connected to GPS. So as long as you have GPS connectivity, there shouldn't be any issue. And there are a few places or cases where there might be issues with GPS connectivity.
Northern Washington County.
Yes.
Yeah, try to get your Wi-Fi to work.
Or 35W at Creek, I mean, that's like, you lose them for a little while.
So it like caches on the device and uploads that later somehow?
Essentially, I believe it's Streetlight's data team told us that even if your phone is in airplane mode, you're still technically connected to GPS satellites. So even if you don't have cell service or data or Wi-Fi, can't make a phone call, you're still going to be connected to the GPS satellites. And I believe essentially that data is cached and then uploaded the next time.
Yeah, because the GPS signal is one way, so your phone is getting a signal, but it's not sending to satellite where you are. It has to have some other data connection to report that somehow eventually.
Yes, correct. Unfortunately, I'm not exactly an expert in how the inner workings of the cell phone GPS.
Except in blizzards.
Yeah, the GPS is not dependent on that at all. Like your watch, it's tracking, it's doing the trekking. It doesn't have a cell signal at all, right?
Right.
So it's
Yeah,
always
my watch can connect to my phone, but not directly to cell towers. And
right, but it's connected to GPS, and they're using GPS to know where we are.
Yeah.
So I found this is extremely interesting and disturbing. Like, I'm gonna throw my cell phone.
Well, and so I think it's worth calling out to that point, the part where they talked about the anonymity. There are different levels of how things can be anonymized, and some are better than others. And this is on the fringes of my areas of expertise, but I did do a little bit of poking around on Streetlight's website to try to see what they were giving as assurances on that. And from what I could tell, at least, they were doing a better job than most about that. So it's important if the council is going to be using these kinds of services, make sure that we're evaluating our vendors to find the ones that are really doing it right. And as far as I can tell, in this case, it was a good choice. But yeah, there are definitely some out there that say they're anonymous and they're not nearly quite as good as you'd like.
But I will say
So
though, and going back to what you were saying on privacy, I know, email services have changing, and now Apple just decides suddenly, whatever you get on your devices, I'm gonna tell everybody that it's open, even when nobody open or read it, so that I screw up all the data for email services, of course. So, and they keep doing changes, especially with GPS and everything. So, I think in 2025, if we do it again and we see that this drop is what it drops, is like the anonymous and privacy walls got higher, which will make me sleep better because now I can't. Yeah, but it's a great study, really, really detailed.
And I would just say one of our favorite things about Streetlight as a vendor is the anonymization is really the best that we found. The GPS data is anonymized before Streetlight gets their hands on it. They anonymize it again, they aggregate it and anonymize it again, and each time a trip starts and ends, it's re-anonymized essentially. So
I'm just a paranoid person, so the GPS problem is Streetlight could be the best thing. I'm just, not talking in front of you.
Well, and Streetlight calls out location-based services uniquely. Like that's like their new selling feature, right? That's their data. It's the largest sample size. It's the most consistent. It's so it actually is sold separately from cellular data, separately from GPS data. That's what they're saying. Or ad data. They're saying, look, there's all this universal stuff, but BS is like, and that's part of their pitch and why they do seem to be the most anonymous and we can't trust ad people at all.
Well,
There's nothing
yeah.
you can trust about that. So, but it seems, is there any opportunity for us directly to begin to, to manage our own data, or to buy the data directly from Streetlight? There's something about kind of, again, there's not going to be less cell phones. And as much as people are suspicious, nobody's backing out. And I can't believe how much we track the heck out of ourselves. We don't care, and it's only going to be more of it. So, is there anything that we start to do? I was saying to Ambassador Lovely about the app that we have. Like, I discovered it. I remember when it came, I've never used it this last year. I think I called you about an app. I just wound up recommending, our app, and so our own use of apps could be really interesting for us in terms of, there's a strategy around increasing really shared information, and when people start, and what is it that happens in terms of people's progression, approach they use, or
Part of that, though, does get into the layers of separation problems. So like what Raven was just saying is Streetlight doesn't even have the initial source data. Somebody else did a level of anonymization, then gave it to them, they did a level of anonymization, another level of that, then gave it to us. If we're collecting things directly, then we have data that's not anonymous. And so there are some things that we might be able to collect that way, but even if we have the capability to collect stuff ourselves, it becomes a lot trickier to do so ethically if we have access to more detail. Like, we might want that detail, but our users might not want us to have that detail. So going through these external vendors lets us be a little bit more hands-off to say, with respect to privacy more, by artificially limiting how much we have. So there might be some things that we can get from, like, the app that you mentioned, but we'd have to be very careful about what. Bob, you had something?
Yeah, and I apologize for getting called out. And you may have already covered this, I'm sure you have. But if I understand right, the cell phone knows where it lives in terms of geography, is that correct?
Yeah, that's a great question.
So there's an address connected to the cell phone?
So it's not based on any address or like the area code of the phone or anything. Streetlight infers home locations based on where a device spends the night. So for example, my cell phone is going to spend the night in my apartment almost every night. So they're going to infer that sort of census tract or zip code is my home location. I've used my number as an example because I have a North Carolina phone number which is registered to a Tennessee address, but Streetlight would use, I'm still on my parents' phone plan, they live in Tennessee, but my Streetlight's methods would still infer that I live in St. Louis Park, because that's where my device is spending its time.
So the number of hours at a location is how it's defined into that zip code? Is that what it does in terms of the implications or the inference?
Yeah, it's based on where the device is between, I believe, 8 p.m. and 7 a.m.
I see, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Which means it also might get thrown off by people who work odd shifts.
Yeah, Streetlight does do some analysis to try to counteract that. It's limited to census blocks, which are residential, so you won't get assigned a home location in like a shopping mall, for example.
Sure.
There's always going to be edge cases that slip through the cracks, but they do a lot of quality control to make them as accurate as possible.
Okay.
Well, it's pretty fascinating if you're not too paranoid about somebody having all this data on you. I mean, the inference of movement into the parks or on the trails, or some of that stuff by time frame is pretty darn interesting.
Yeah, we think so.
Yeah, I would think that would be a fascinating project
Yeah,
that you worked on.
it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah.
As a non-local Minnesotan, it's been very fun to get to learn more about all of our state parks and regional parks and trails over the last couple of years.
Were there any disturbing things that you found in your research?
Disturbing? I don't think so. No, I don't think so. I think there are lots of exciting and interesting things, but I don't think I was disturbed.
See, Monica, you're okay.
No, for this study though.
No, you gotta think about it. I mean, there's cameras all over cities, you know, outside stores and businesses and, you know, police tracking you. I mean,
Oh yeah, I know we're getting tracked, but the deep level of how tracked you are is where you're.
yeah, I've given up worrying
But
about
it does
that.
make me wonder though, what about children? Because not all of them have cell phones and they use a lot of the parks.
Yeah, that is a great question. We actually just confirmed this last week with Streetlight's team. We talked to them just to make sure we had this right. Any devices that are registered to minors are excluded, so minors are not explicitly in the project, in the sampled data, but like any sort of statistical analysis or study, they're taking a sample and then modeling and sort of extrapolating out to account for children and other groups that might not own as many smartphones. So they do a lot of correction on their end so that we're not just ignoring children in the data.
So
But I should think
we at
it's
least
more
cannot
accurate than
directly
yours.
measure any changes to youth use. Any of that is a pretty fuzzy guess compared to everything else.
Yeah, with this data source, I think part of the data privacy is minors are just not included in the sample at all.
And that's important since, you know, youth are one of the categories we call out in our equity analysis stuff. It would be good to know that that is one that this one doesn't address as much as it does our other demographics. Sue?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The webinar recordings, Raven, are the webinar recordings from last week?
Yes, yes.
Good. I had hoped to be a part of those, but ended up with major roof construction at my home. And anyway, didn't happen, but thank you. It'll be great to see those.
Now, I know anytime you look at a smaller subset of data, it becomes less statistically valid. And I'm wondering what the limits of that are in terms of time. What I'm getting at is we've had this problem of, for instance, with our equity grant program. We're saying, okay, we are giving you some money to go do a particular project at a particular park or trail that you say is going to change its equitable impact. And with our current intercept surveys saying those only happen every 5 years, and it probably takes 2 or 3 checks to really be valid. It might be 10 or 15 years after the project before we have any idea whether that money made any difference. But you showed us a graph that had different data points every week. How many weeks would it take for us to see whether we have an impact from something we changed reliably?
A great question, and I think something that's probably going to vary a lot case by case. With this kind of data, there's kind of a trade-off between spatial specificity and temporal specificity. So if you want a week's worth of data, you're going to need to look at a pretty large geographic area. If you want a very small geographic area, you're going to need to look at a month or a season.
Like if I wanted to dig into demographic data on race or income or something like that, kind of time frame does that become valid?
You know, I don't have a great answer for that off the top of my head. I think We know that Streetlight is going to not report any data under a certain threshold. So if we're not getting, 100 visits per day, for example, that's not quite the right number. But if there's less than a certain amount of activity, we're not going to get any data at all. My intuition, I would want probably at least a summer or a year's worth, depending on the specific question. But again, it's going to vary so much from case to case that I don't have a great answer.
Okay, so it's safe to assume not a week, not a month, but not 10 years either. A year or two would probably give us something useful-ish.
Yeah, that would be my guess. I wouldn't look at 2 data points and say, yes, we made a change this week, but over a season or a year, I think we can start to make that
would be
inference.
Literally an order of magnitude better than what we have now. Anthony?
Can we monitor a phone? Even in terms, just, is there a way that they go, well, that phone came to a park with some humans that they liked, twice. And they came once at some point when we did an activity and they came again. Is there any?
Oh.
Yeah, because that.
So not necessarily we're identifying a phone, but knowing our visits, new visitors versus repeat visitors.
Exactly, and I think in terms of initiatives, could we go that our goal was an initial visit. So much of, particularly around equity, is like initial visits, and measure of success would be return. Or so, is there a way to go that data point? Like I said, a phone, they drive, take people places. Showed up with some people in it.
Unfortunately, not with Streetlight. They sort of re-anonymize the device each trip. So that's one sort of key difference with this data, is we can't tell if somebody's coming for the first time or the 100th. So that would be interesting.
Yeah, that is getting into some of the things that have been controversial, because once you have that tag, it becomes a lot harder to keep that tag anonymous. Because you can say like, yeah, I have no idea whose phone this is, but I know that they went to this park and they live here and they shop here and they, I'll bet it's probably this person.
And they bought size 9 shoes at Target.
Yeah.
Even they were looking for kayaks the other day.
Exactly.
Yeah. Monica, did I see your hand up?
No, I'm fine.
Must have been Cecily.
Maybe this is way far down the road. I don't know if there are any skiers here, but when you buy a ski pass now, every time you go up the lift, it bings. And at the end of the day, you can get elevation, you can get number of runs you've done, and you can get it for the whole season. It's remarkable. And I think right now, I've got a Washington County sticker on my car. And all Washington County knows is I've bought the sticker every year and put it on my car. They have no idea if I've ever been to a Washington County park or trail. But I don't know if anybody's taken, these ski pass ideas and tried them in parks and trails. Hey, it'll be interesting. And I think there'd be some people who might want to do it.
Some of what I'm hearing as possible things for staff to include as maybe questions and intercept surveys is something that measures with our actual visitors, what is your threshold for what you think is useful information versus what do you think is creepy? What are you willing to share to make your park better versus what is seen as intrusive?
And not doing it, because the ski pass, the problem is that you have to opt out. You have to almost opt out of Vail's program, and we hate Vail. And
I do Icon.
So Icon, same, but you still have to opt out, right? When you sign up for Icon Pass, unless you opt out, and it is great. People love it. It is such entertainment. So again, it just winds up being. It is. People love it, right? So
it's like counting your steps.
Exactly. So that was my point earlier.
It is. I have just much elevation.
How many miles you ran?
Right. People are signing up, and that was my question
but
for
my
us.
lot tracks right then.
Right. People want that data, and are we willing to offer some experience around that? Even at Worth, we were trying to figure out, could we get insurance companies to give people credit for running 3 miles as they go walk and just check in at the fitness center, which is like a weird thing, right? You don't have to work out, you just have to check in. So we were trying to investigate, would health partners do the same $50 a month payment for a person who just showed up at our park 3 days a week, And we could say that they actually went for a mile walk because they would be able to check in
Verify.
here and here, you know, or ski on a trail or ride a mountain bike. We know what they did. Would they be willing to do that? And would people sign up for that if they got $50 a month?
Well, Health Partners does that now for lifetime. I
I'm
get
saying they
$20
do it for health clubs, and you don't have to work out. You just have to show up.
I have to
You have to, all you have to do is
click
check
in
in.
12 times.
And people do that all the time. There are
Maybe
people,
check in, go to the bathroom, go out.
you know. And
Yeah,
so
we've had that with my health insurance some years too, I track my steps for me,
you track your steps.
but there's a difference between having it for me versus sharing it with my health insurance, and there's also, I think for most people at least, they might be more willing to share with their health insurance than with a government agency, which is what we are.
That's
So
fine.
there's a couple of tiers here.
Who do you trust more?
Well, on the positive side, I mean, the idea of marketing, hey, this is some interesting stuff that you might be
Track your
interested
steps.
in knowing, and it's an opt-in as opposed to opt-out here.
Yes.
You know,
That's always
so
the
I
best.
think as you're asking the staff, you know, hey, can you creatively think about some options here that you might want to try
Well, and
from a marketing standpoint?
And for me, I'm seeing a lot of potential for this kind of data in the very aggregate way for possibly giving us more specific guidance for ultimately some of our money stuff, which at this point I don't know that we have enough to really commit to anything like that, and it's, I'm sure, making all of the IAs nervous that I even mentioned it. But as something to explore, it really bums me out that you said this is one of the things that they took away, but the bicycle and pedestrian use, one of the things that clicked for me immediately was when you mentioned that you could see which ones were probably transportation use because they were commuting around 9 and 5.
Yeah.
If we had data to back that up, then we could go to the other aspect of the council that controls transportation money and say, hey, here's what percentage of this trail's use appears to be transportation related. Can we have that percentage of its use funded out of transportation dollars instead of park dollars? Can't get that data anymore, that goes up in the air, but that was one of the things. But also, we've never been able to have per park or per trail data that was statistically valid before. And one of the things that I've harped on, these people have heard, you haven't been here for this before, we've only ever had a way to add things into the regional park system, and we bring them in with it saying, we anticipate that such and such percentage of their use will be non-local visits. And we have no way of ever following up on that currently. So if we can dig into zip code level, not even county, but zip code level, that gives us a way to say, okay, for Theodore Worth, what percentage of its users come from somewhere outside of its park implementing agency boundaries, which is supposed to be a significant measure of what qualifies as regional, is does it get non-local visits? And if we can actually get data on that for every unit periodically, that would give us a serious way to evaluate, are we fulfilling one of the fundamental goals of being a regional system versus these being local amenities? And again, I don't know what level of that qualifies as statistically significant and how often we could do that evaluation, but any way that we could dig into individual units and say what percentage of visits are non-local, that would be a serious step up that we've never had access to before. That could be really handy for us. Yes, Anthony?
Tony, do you think, do you actually, so let me say, do you actually think we don't have good data that we are serving, that the parks that we identify as regional are serving regional parks, are serving a regional audience? And that's interesting because I do think that in some, trails are incredibly regional, for example. Like, you know, and trails themselves tend to be very regional, right? Because people want to go somewhere, right?
Yeah, so currently what staff have been telling us is that they're able to statistically validly measure at the agency level and say, okay, Dakota County's system has such and such number of visits that appear to be from outside of Dakota County, but we have no idea if you wanted to compare Lebanon Hills versus Whitetail Woods. Does one of those get 40% non-local visits and the other one get 2% non-local visits? We have no way of drilling down into the individual units to know that. We only know for the agency, they seem to be doing some stuff. But how the individual parking trail units contribute into those numbers, they've told us at that level they don't have enough data points for it to be valid. Whereas this has way more data points, so it allows us to look at things and draw conclusions that we couldn't with our intercept survey.
Are you suspicious?
I wouldn't say suspicious, so it may be that everything in the system is doing amazing, but we don't currently have a way of communicating that to the public. We don't have the accountability to say, hey, look, we evaluated and all of our things are meeting our goals. We're saying, well, you don't really have the data to say it. We think they probably are, but we can't back it up. And so I would really like if we could go out back to our voters and taxpayers and citizens and say, hey, we know that everything is doing what we say it's supposed to do, and if it didn't, we'd have a way to detect that. And it's an evaluation that I think would be important to do at some point. Anyone else? I'm sure we're going to have more questions later because this is super cool.
Fascinating.
Thank you for all the great discussion. I think
Thank
this is the last time I'm presenting this, so it's fun to get it in one last time and hear a lot of really great ideas. So thank you all.
Thank you. Maybe pick your brain about things later as we think of more questions. All right, thank you. That brings us to our next one. We've been a little long on this, but that's okay. Dan Marckel and Colin Kelly, we have another visit to the 2050 Regional Development Guide, exploring shared regional goals and policy area objectives. Sounds very managerial. Go ahead.
We'll try. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Councilmember, Commissioners. I am Colin Kelly, Planning Analyst in the Regional Parks Unit, and I'm here with Dan Marckel, Planning Analyst in the Research Unit. Today we're here to provide you with an update on the 2050 Regional Development Guide and the Regional Parks Policy Plan update, and to seek your advice on shared regional goals and policy area objectives. But before we get into our discussion of goals and objectives, I'd like to quickly cover some aspects of our timeline for the Parks Policy Plan and the associated Regional Development Guide work. Hopefully this timeline should look pretty familiar to you. We shared this with you back in March and in April. So I'll just hit on a couple of high points here, 2 or 3. As you can see at the top of this timeline, we've got 4 major phases of the project. We're currently in the process of transitioning from the first to the second phase, initiation to planning. Quarter 2 of 2023 is coming right up. We're basically here. So we're moving into the next phase, and it's an important one for us. I'd also like to point out the green bar that sits just below most parts of this timeline. This is a reminder that the Parks Policy Plan update is happening at the same time as and in close coordination with the Regional Development Guide work. So even though we often talk about the Regional Parks Policy Plan by itself, separately, it's really a chapter or a component of the Regional Development Guide, like other council policy plans and systems like transportation, wastewater, and housing. Council staff are and will continue to be taking an integrated approach to this work this year and next and beyond. That said, our focus is squarely in the regional parks policy area, and we'll continue to work in that space with you and our implementing agencies through the rest of this year and much of next year. Just a couple of other key things to point out on the timeline. In March 2024, next March, we intend to have a draft or a 60% plan complete. In August of next year, we intend to have a final draft or about a 90% plan complete. Before that, of course, we'll continue to meet with you, our agency and council work groups. We'll be talking about them in just a few minutes. Our implementing agency directors, community groups, and others to co-develop this parks policy area. But again, today we're focused on shared regional goals and policy area objectives. These goals and objectives will connect regional values and regional vision statements, which you've heard a little bit about, and you'll hear more about in just a minute, with the more specific parks policies and actions, which kind of are the equivalent of day-to-day work in our parks and on our trails. To get us started on this topic, I'll pass it over to Dan.
Thanks, Colin. So I've got 4 or 5 slides just to give you a sense of that overall regional development guide process and what we're doing. Hopefully, Councilmember Vento will recognize some of these slides and some of the content I'm going to say, and will correct me. Doing this work is kind of like watching a flock of geese land on a lake. You know, they're coming all over the place, all over the place. This particular version of the presentation, I think it's got the most up-to-date things, but we may have to switch out some geese here and there. So the overall process is for the regional development guide and the policy plans is embedded in this diagram. Imagine it flowing from top to bottom. We start with looking at the existing conditions of the region and what are the emerging challenges and changes. That includes the demographic kind of work that happens, and it's all kicked off by the decennial census, of course. So folks have been working on that material for a while, and the council has been working with some folks in community development to articulate a set of values and vision to offer as sort of general guidance for what are the big issues in the region and what do we want to do in our work. At the same time, go to the bottom of that diagram, and there are people in the land use area, people in the housing area, parks, transportation, water, who are doing very specific work about what are the issues in water, what are the issues in transportation. They're figuring out what wants to push from the bottom of this diagram upwards towards the general values and vision that have been articulated by the council. We find ourselves, I think it's even on here, isn't it? Yeah, thank you, Colin. We find ourselves at the moment where these things are coming together, where we have values and visions articulated. We've got some information from individual policy areas articulated, and we're trying to sort out how would we articulate goals and objectives that match the two up. So I would say both of them are in process, and this is the fun, messy part of the whole thing. Here are some of the values that have been identified, or 4 core values that have been identified by the council. Equity, leadership, accountability, and stewardship. And I will let you work on the details of that, the definitions of those. But they're sort of core beliefs that we want to do our work on within. Important. And a second step of this is to get a little more explicit about what do we want to do on the backs of those values. What do we think is important to do for the region? And these are 4 kind of categories that you'll see reappearing time and time again. It's where the council has sort of embraced these 4 statements. It's not going to be necessarily limited to these 4 statements forever, but these are the core ones in place. And they're aspirational statements. Our regional is equitable, inclusive, and welcoming. And you'll see in the text, there's a little bit of a good news, bad news situation in each of those paragraphs. Our quality of life is high, but not all communities share this. Looking to the future, we envision where inequities and injustices have been eliminated and residents and newcomers feel welcome, included, and empowered. So there's a kind of like philosophical statement about this is an area we need to work on, and we think we can work on it. So equitable, inclusive, and welcoming is one of those vision statements. I won't read through all those in great detail, but healthy, safe, and vibrant communities is another one of those vision directions. An emphasis, number 3, on lead on addressing climate change. Take a real strong look at that. This is a particularly fun one for me because 10 years ago when we were working on Thrive, there was an active discussion about how real climate change actually was. Is it actually happening? Is it not? I think we've decided it is happening, and we can do something about it. So a vision statement, we lead on addressing climate change. And then the fourth, we protect and restore natural systems. This one hits pretty close to the heart of parks, but it also hits pretty close to the heart of our wastewater and water quality people. Even our transportation people are in favor of protecting and restoring natural systems. So those are the vision components that you'll hear us refer to again and again at this point. And they've been, I want to say handed down from on high. Maybe Sue can say that. But they've been generated by this general discussion at the council level, and they represent things that are important to the region. We now find ourselves at the moment, and see those ovals at the top, don't try and read them because the text is too small, but those ovals at the top are those 4 vision statements. And this diagram shows activating that natural system one. We protect and restore natural systems. One of our natural systems is water. When we say natural systems, it used to be that environmental services would raise their hand and say, we got this, we do water, we're all about the water, we're gonna protect natural water, and we're gonna clean it, and we do it great, thank you very much. But it's become pretty clear to everybody that even with the budgets that environmental services has, they can't make clean water because land use has something to do with it too. And so does transportation, and so does parks, and so does housing. Everything we touch can help clean water is a specific example. So the purpose of this diagram is to say, we're kind of looking for those statements that are in that sort of blue rectangles, the light blue rectangles that say, what are the things we can say as regional goals that can inform work in each of the things? The animation, comment all over this, thank you. So there we are, that middle section, shared regional goals is what we're looking for. And it leads to and is informed by what you guys can do really strongly, which is parks area objectives. So working from the bottom up, what are the objectives parks needs to take on? How does that match up with the shared regional goals? What's missing, what should be at the top, what should be at the bottom? That's the game we're involved in. Is this my slide? Mm-hmm. Okay. So in general, to simplify this all, we're sort of playing this game with people. It's a simple game, but it leads to more complexity to go along with line. There are those ovals again, the 4 policy vision components. And you can see if we have a vision component that says our region is equitable, inclusive, and welcoming, we can continue talking that sentence or that paragraph by saying the regional park system contributes to this by idea 1, idea 2, idea 3. You guys are the idea makers here. Staff has taken a whack at this too, but we want to give it kind of a clean look for you guys. So it's pretty simple. If this is a vision component, what does parks do about that? And for all those vision components, that's the game today, I think, and that's where we're starting. How do I do on time?
Pretty well, I think.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Any questions? Because I'll be sitting here to represent this sort of big picture thing.
Yeah, I do. I mean, this is a 2050 plan. So in the 4th column, we protect and restore natural systems. Are we restoring the pre-conquest to now, to 2050? I mean.
This is why there are specific plans for specific policy areas. Certainly there are areas that pre-colonization, return to pre-colonized status is a goal. And maybe in some of the park reserves that would be a legitimate goal, and it could be done and measured and implemented. We're also concerned about what is the natural systems in, let's say, north end of St. Paul. There's Marydale Park with a little tiny lake. It's not a great natural system, but it's pretty significant symbolically for that area. So sometimes it'll be like a super duper restored natural system, we're also interested in the ones that simply make people's lives better because it's a natural system that helps their, and in that case, we can sort of go over to cross between protecting the natural systems to make a healthy, safe, and vibrant community. So it's like, we're going every direction. There's no stoplights here. It's like a smash up derby.
And there's certainly some ways that our policies get impacted by other columns because simply restoring to pre-colonial times doesn't make sense for some things when you consider it under the heading of addressing climate change. I know the DNR has had a bunch of stuff published about this where they're talking about trying to actively change tree species in certain areas.
Well, exactly, and that's why I raised the question.
Yeah, because they're not expected to
Because
survive.
white pines are probably not going to be a thing in 2050 in the metro area.
So we have to write things in a way that's general enough to say, evaluate case by case basis, different units, different things. What does natural mean? And what are we looking to protect or restore?
I wanted to add one thing and point out, Cecily, that the City of Minneapolis Forestry Department just planted a Kentucky coffee tree in my boulevard. I'm like, whoa, that's a new one. And but I think that they're trying to think out. One of the things that our director, Lisa, has challenged us to do is to think beyond maybe our traditional conservation model of just like, where's the high quality natural areas? Where is that area now protected? How do we protect it? And then sort of run that thinking out. But really to think more broadly about conservation in all areas, that all areas of the region really have something to contribute to the improving the quality of our natural systems. So I just wanted to, I think the thinking is evolving there.
And that's a useful word too. Natural systems is different from just a natural spot, like how things outside of the park boundaries relate is useful. I have a little bit of a wrench to throw into what your stuff is. I don't know where this fits, but you have this lovely image on here that shows the multiple areas of land use policies, housing policies, parks, transportation, water, and you talked about how you're looking at how some of these relate. I'm wondering if somewhere in the text of this plan we can specifically lay out a goal for the council of doing a better job of connecting across those policy areas. And part of what I'm getting at there, like you've heard here our frustration before about how there's not public transit to most of our parks. And if only somebody had a transit system that could maybe adapt to that. And then there's TAB and stuff under the council, but we operate so much as sort of our silos and like, they look at the finances, which they obviously have to, and they're guided really pretty rigidly by that, and so the parks don't really fit in if it doesn't help pay for it. But if we had higher level guidance that says, hey, we're saying that there's a priority of trying to go across these multiple areas of our responsibility, maybe that would change the calculus a little bit. So I'm wondering if there's a way that we can somehow say that, hey, the council is recognizing that we have multiple responsibilities that are intertwined enough that we should do a better job than we have historically of trying to cross those over to each other. Like water's an easy one where we can say, yeah, that ties into a whole bunch of stuff. The transit to parks one is one of the harder ones of those, but it could fall under that umbrella.
So, Mr. Chair, I'm pleased to report that that's not a wrench for us, that's our starting point. And if you recall, about 2 or 3 years ago, there was what was considered a relatively minor update to the Regional Parks Policy Plan. Mm-hmm. There was also at the same time a minor update to the Transportation Policy Plan. And those were done so that we could get on the same cycle of planning to set a new course of plans that they would all come out at the same time. So part of the game that we're playing here is we've established a kind of vocabulary that all the plans are going to have to follow so that we can look across those different divisions when we look at one of our examples. Yeah, very perfect example. And say, what are we doing for clean water? And, what's a clean water nonprofit that we could talk to? Clean Water Action?
Yeah, fresh water.
Fresh water.
Yeah.
They would say, dear Met Council, here's our letter for your plan. What are you doing for clean water? And we'll more easily be able to say, we're glad you asked. In land use, here's what we're doing for clean water. In transportation, here's what we're doing in our environmental services. So we can find those connections across the divisions better. And that was a pretty clear critique of some of the work in Thrive, that it didn't necessarily add up. People would say, you're asking us to do this in transportation, but we don't have the water to do it. Or you're asking us to do this in parks, but we don't have the transportation to do it. So that kind of alignment is like near and dear to my heart, yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
Bob.
Mr. Chair and Dan, when I look at this vision, I like it in general, and yet it misses for me the sense of the vision of transportation. In terms of, partially, ties in with what the chair was saying, but also the bigger overriding vision of transportation in 2050. Not only safety, which is identified here, but how it ties together and brings together various components of our society. Maybe I'm missing sifting it out here, but as I think about this vision for our regional planning efforts, transportation being a very big part. I mean, we're spending gazillion dollars on light rail and rapid bus and highways. I don't think we want to just leave it to the highway department to find that. So I'm just saying, it doesn't feel like to me this is speaking to such an important component of our plan.
Mr. Chair and members, I take that point really seriously. And I will say that we are trying, and one of the joys of this work is that each of these policy areas has their own language and culture and requirements and history, and part of the method here is to continue to bring these back together so that points like that emerge. So I really appreciate it. I really appreciate it. And as we go forward, I will put it on my notes and try and keep track of it, but I hope you will too. Yeah, this is a game for everybody to play, for sure. There's also, as part of the method of this 2050 plan, a chance for us to say strong statements like that at the beginning of the plan, in the overarching sections of the plan, and then work more specifically on what exactly would we do in transportation to achieve that goal. So the comment that I hear you say is a kind of wonderfully philosophical comment about how these things relate to each other.
What is the vision? Transportation is a huge deal.
Could we, the vision of transportation could be kind of like, our region is equitable, inclusive, accessible, and welcoming, because access is what gets transportation. And I do agree with Bob and Tanya. We need them on the vision because it's this high. It's like, I call it also, in this case it's not marketing, but the only way that our people are gonna know region parks is if they can visit the parks. If they can get there, then it won't be able to. So I do think it should be, not only in a goal on all the part, but it should be part of the vision that we have, because our vision is that everybody will be able to be at these parks. And it comes with everybody has access to clean water, and everybody has access to the access to understanding how is climate changing and all the natural systems. So I think that would be something to add at the higher level.
That'd be great, but money isn't shared equally among
No, but this is just a vision, so I think if this is a vision, then we are gonna be able to move it around, so the money doesn't, we can just go and say, hey, give me all of that, I get that. But if it's part of that foundation, then it should be part of the.
Well, there may be
aspiration.
public transportation in my area by 2050.
Yeah, I just think at this point probably.
Maybe a cell tower by 2050.
Mr. Chair,
I think
Yeah.
transportation will change.
Or a
Yes,
cell
Sue.
tower.
one of the critical things with transportation is going to be ridership. And so not all areas in reality will get it. It's gonna depend on whether you've got the ridership. So I think transportation's a really valid point. I think it's worth, focusing on it, but at least, and I'm sitting here, I'm a former elementary teacher, and so when I did planning, I was planning for tomorrow and next week and next month and next year. I wasn't planning 20 years down, 30 years down the road. So for me to wrap my head around a 2050 plan it's a form of mental contortion that makes me dizzy. And I was always changing those plans on a regular basis too. But I will tell you, being on the transportation committee, it's gonna have a lot of what ifs. What ifs in terms of funding, ridership, employees, will we have the operations staff, the drivers, all of the things we need to support it. And in the meantime, are there some ways we can make small steps? And I'm sitting here thinking, yeah, there are gonna be a lot of school bus drivers not driving school buses this summer. Could they be driving buses to parks? Maybe not on a regular daily basis, but what could we do in the meantime? So I think we've got to be open to the concept. I think we've got to be committed to the vision, but we've also got to be realistic that it won't all happen for everybody on the same timeline.
Well, I will also, sorry, Tony, I will also say we have to understand that transportation is going to change. What we see, the concept of transportation as, buses and red trains, that is going to change. Mm-hmm. We don't take taxis anymore, we take Uber. So it could be a way that we simplify all that and have a program that will help people to get an Uber card so they can get a ride somewhere. So I think transportation is one of the things that we have to change the way we see it. That's why I say access is just what we need.
And Sue, not having any visibility into how the transportation planning works, I'm wondering a bit about what is feasible. How different are routes at different times? Like you say, maybe not every day. Are there routes that run, I know there's been commuting things, but in the opposite, would it be possible to have routes to certain parks that only run on the weekend? Is that reasonably easy to do?
At this point, it's not easily reasonable to do because we don't have all of our pre-pandemic routes back up and running. We're still dealing with major schedule changes for a number of portions of the metro area.
Yeah. And I don't necessarily mean this year as a concept.
I'm a member of the transportation committee. I'm a newbie on there, so I shouldn't be saying this, but boy, I'd propose it. I'd argue for the concept of special kinds of transportation opportunities, but whether or not it's going to happen 10, 20, 30 years from now, a lot remains to be seen. And the other piece of it is can we also convince the legislature that this is a good idea?
Sure. And another piece I want to tie into goes back to some of the things we were talking about earlier about if you make a change, can you measure whether it worked and knowing whether the things that you think are going to work actually happened. You say everything's dependent on ridership, but of course you don't know what the ridership is until you actually try it. If you did implement, say, we're going to have one park that we identify that has a bus route to it just on the weekends. What is the process for getting to deciding whether you think that's likely to be feasible enough to try it? And that's a valid answer. And then once you do try it, how long does it need to be in place for someone to decide whether it worked or not?
I don't know the answer to either of those.
Okay.
And it could be just a far-fetched Suvento dream. But I figured nothing ventured, nothing gained. Go for it.
So I guess those would be two of the questions that I would ask in a transportation meeting sometimes, like, can you try this? Or like, is that 8-year process to evaluate a route, or can you just go, you know what, starting 3 months from now, we're gonna run that for a month and see what happens?
Well, and I will also tell you that there's a great desire, a great expectation to expand transit. There's been a heavy concentration of our transit dollars in certain portions of the 7-county metro area. And having represented in old District 11 and now possibly in new District 12, got to get reappointed to that, right, Mr. Chair? But those areas have expectations as well. So where we fit with those other parts of the region that want transit, plus where we fit in terms of let's say our Metro Mobility services. Metro Mobility does not serve the entire 7-county region. It's got a federally defined boundary, and then it's got a secondary boundary. And so we have to try and fit into all that. So it's complicated, but like I said, nothing ventured, nothing gained, I guess.
Okay. So Cecily, and then I want to come back to you guys to see how far we've drawn you off track.
Yeah, but what I was thinking with transportation, and this may just be at a city or a county level, but transportation departments or public works departments classify whether it's an arterial or a connector road or, you know, all the different levels. Well, we also have categories in our regional park system. So that, you know, our major parks that have high visitation, that have a lot of different amenities, you know, might be the higher priority to get people to than smaller off-site regional parks that don't have a lot of visitation, or regional trails are barely used.
Yeah.
So how do you get the higher priority?
And that makes me think a little bit of a project the DNR did a couple of years ago, where they went through all the state parks and put them into categories that was largely related to funding and management and stuff. But for our purposes, we might consider doing something similar for that kind of organization. So what I wanted to ask was, I think I probably drew you a little bit off of, what is it you're wanting specifically from us today? And is any of this contributing to that? Or are we giving you other?
Can I answer that question, Dan, first or not?
Let's see.
Can you go back to the colorful slide earlier? Because I really like this slide. Back.
The one with the post-its.
Yeah.
With the chevron.
Yeah, the chevron, that's the word.
So here the parks sits, or here, right here. Today, I think is your opportunity to push up on what should these shared goals and objectives be? What do we really need to be thinking about collectively and make sure is represented in this larger plan so that we can do the work we need to do in our policy area. But go, Dan and Colin.
Can I say one more thing about transportation before you answer, Dan? Mr. Chair, please.
Yes.
Should have. We already have transit available to some of our regional parks.
Do we?
We do some, yeah.
You know, like the Phelan Regional Park. You can take the bus there. Harriet, or Hiawatha, you can take the bus to Hiawatha, Nokomis. You can take the bus to Theodore Worth.
Highline too?
Huh?
Highline?
You can take it to Highland.
Yeah, there's pretty good service to the ones within, you know, City of St.
So-
Paul, Minneapolis Park Direct.
I think to your point, Cecily, I think that's already happening. There is accessibility to some of our more major parks. It's the outer.
But that's a problem for transit.
Right.
Period.
Right.
You know what I mean? So.
Yeah, totally. Okay, I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, that's valid. Go Dan.
So, Mr. Chair, that was pretty close. That was real good, actually. As good as I've seen. In my wildest aspirations for this time, in the next 4 minutes that are left.
Oh, we can go beyond
We
that.
schedule a
Okay.
special session.
In my wildest aspirations, you would tell everybody else in the council, all those other chevrons, what they should do for parks goals. And that's an invitation to push into that goals and objective space. Now, that's a heavy lift for a lot of Minnesotans. So my step back goal might be what are your goals and objectives for parks? What are the things that you really want to work on in parks? What I'm hearing in that discussion about transit and parks and access, there might very well be a study at hand which says, just for information purposes, which of our regional parks and trails have transit access at what level already. And there could be a project with Metro Transit to like start to talk to each other and figure out each other's language and requirements and goals. And you know, that's the kind of I don't know, learning each other's culture that would be possible. So you ask, does this help at all? Yes, it does. This kind of conversation, we're constantly trying to harvest great ideas for actions and policies. I mean, maybe a policy statement around that and maybe it already exists in the plan, I don't even know, would be, you know, ensure great access to parks. And part of the actions part of that would be, we need to know more about transit access in parks. Or Ubering in parks.
Or possibly putting numbers to that, or like have X percentage of our parks accessible, like within a mile of a transit line or something like that, whatever that percentage may be that's feasible.
Once you open up the discussion, there's probably gonna be somebody in some cubicle in transportation that says, you know, I'm working on an electric bike project, but the problem is there's no chargers at regional parks. And so could we do a project to do chargers and all of a sudden you'd have a few more people getting to things. So I'd say ask the question and the system will activate ideas.
We'll go with Bob first.
How do opt-out transportation agencies fit into this Metro Council plan? Because we've got in the Rosemount, Apple Valley, Burnsville area, major opt-out. We've got in Eden Prairie, the Southwest Metro, Chanhassen, Chaska, Eden Prairie. I mean, I don't know, and there are probably others in the community that I don't know about, but are we speaking for them as well with this plan, or are they considered or not considered in our thinking?
That would all fall under TAB, I believe. Don't you think, Lisa? Or
Go ahead and join us.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Chair, Council Commissioners. Lisa Barajas, Executive Director of the Community Development Division. Our transportation policy plan covers the entire region. Opt-outs are another stakeholder in that work, another agency that we work with, just like how in community development we work with regional parks implementing agencies and our parks, local government partners as part of that work. So they were part of the transportation policy planning process and going through their mechanisms as well as a part of that. So they're part of that. Their plans are coordinated with Metro Transit, and when you're talking about service coordination, which is on a shorter term basis, but for long-term vision, there are stakeholders in the process.
So they would essentially be expected to be included in the vision, or said they would be expected to be in agreement with the vision of transportation.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, the plan or the vision is not the council's vision, but the vision for the region that is informed by residents and stakeholders across the region. No one agency gets to have more of a sway than residents of the region in this work. They are an important partner in the work, but are not the driver or the owner of the vision per se.
Function kind of like a transportation implementation agency in a way that our park wants to.
well, and kind of have that role as participants in TAP.
That is correct.
Yeah.
The reason I brought that up is because as we're thinking about expanding our parks and trail system, the opt-outs may have an important role to play in accessibility and transportation to those.
I think Sue just told us something that some of us may not have known before, which is that those agencies sit on TAB
Right,
They have representation.
they have representation on there. They're not all individually on there,
Yeah.
but they have representatives.
But that fact is something that
Yeah.
I didn't know.
At least if there's more that I said that you need to clean up after, now's the time to do it.
Mr. Chair, not as cleanup, but something I just wanted to emphasize, I think a point that Dan had made is that in this process, and I know we've talked about this a little bit in the past, in this process, our goal in this cycle as staff that we've been working really hard toward it before we even have been having public conversations with our council members and other stakeholders in the region is to build a comprehensive plan for the region. One that isn't just a collection of what our different divisions are responsible for, but rather are aligned toward shared goals and shared objectives and working to advance a shared regional vision. We are a product of our history where our different divisions were separate agencies when they were originally formed and only really came together in the 90s when legislation changed to have all of transit and environmental services become part of the Metropolitan Council, which had been a standalone planning agency previously. So putting us all together means that it takes some time, some culture change to work through and figure out how we work together. And in this cycle, this is where we're really putting that to the test and really working to create comprehensive plans, not a series of plans that we think are largely aligned with one another, but developing all of this work together and in parallel. So our conversations are happening here at MPOSC. At the same time, there are conversations happening with TAB and their technical committees, happening with our Land Use Advisory Committee, happening with other groups and regional, local government stakeholders and others across the region in a variety of venues, in addition to the engagement work that I know Colin has spoken about previously here, but also similar engagement efforts happening across all of our divisions, work that we're internally coordinating amongst ourselves and sharing and trying to bring back and share more broadly with all of you and our council members about what we've been hearing from all of these places across all of our work together. More collectively. So I just wanted to give you that bigger picture overview. I know that the conversations here obviously are focused on parks, but I wanted to assure you that a lot of our conversations with our with staff internally are with all of the teams across the council about how do we do this and how do we advance this vision together.
Okay.
Anthony.
Thank you.
You know, I just been looking at it and I'm thinking about just some of the work at council level above us, where there is a very strong focus for the council to think intersectionally, right? I mean, just in a real way. And one of the challenges and new thinking for me really is that transportation, the dollars, the actual dollar amount of transportation is so significant that we could do major change in other areas with rounding errors. And that's where it's missing. Like, we're not actually designing the transportation, like taking advantage of the you know, it's such a big number that if we wanted to actually add $30 million, I mean, that's that to some type of program to make parks actualize, we could do that. So like, that's what's missing. Housing is the same thing. This legislative session, we're gonna do some affordable housing, damn it. That's what the legislature said. You all are gonna do some affordable housing. There will not be one bike in there and they will not be able to catch the bus. That is not included in that. You know what I'm saying? And so is there a way that we do this? I don't know, it's goals, objectives. I literally said to myself, I'm not doing one more damn sticky note on a piece of paper. I am so sick of being engaged. You can't even believe it. I mean, just am. And we have to stop doing this. We have to stop doing this. This is just, you get paid, this looks great, you get sticky notes, it's just bullshit, you guys. We gotta stop doing this. We gotta take what you know, what you have been going through. And as an educator, you are a person whose feet are on the street in the community you live in. Like, for real, all of us. And so to take the knowledge of the size and scale of housing we will build, roads we will build, and lean those investments towards people being connected to outdoors as part of the way they will live, because that's what matters to this region, would be significant. The dollars would be huge. I mean, you know, in this $16 million, you know, V3 got more money than that. Did you guys see that in the legislative thing? I love Erica. I mean, this is not they got more money than the parks. One project. You all, we are not, I'm just saying, like, this is fun sticky notes on paper, and we're not sitting with you, Sue, honestly, and saying, in transportation, in community development, honestly, let's look at the dollars.
The one thing that is challenging, and Lisa, guide me with how I say this, but I would love to be able to go to the transportation committee on Monday night and say, okay, guys, we gotta find our rounding errors, and we gotta turn it over to MPOS. We don't have that kind of discretion.
That's not what I mean by discretion.
Okay.
It is intersectionality.
Okay.
That's what I'm talking about.
Okay, I just wanna.
No, I agree. I'm saying, but it is.
It is.
Because we get transportation wrong with more money than we put into the park system. Like, we
get a whole
always
lot
get
of
it
things,
wrong.
yeah.
I mean, the margin of error when we build the plus or minus that we do on big system work we do is bigger than the money we spend on parks, is all I'm saying. And so what if that we really are intersectional? That what our ask is that everything you do that is related to land use, housing, or transportation includes something integrally delivering on connecting people to parks. Or something like that, because I'm just telling you, the dollars we're talking about is not that much anymore.
Do we do that to some extent already with land use, Lisa?
In land use, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Vento, in land use, we're, there's always a scoring for access to parks as part of that. As part of land use, we're also looking at access to transportation access across the region.
That's what we're doing, and the LCDA applications are coming due. Like, you look, Susan, you all have to go to these. Sue's job is not easy. You go and
their jobs aren't easy because they have to deal with me.
I'm just saying that this idea of we have these, so that you just choosing the LCDA applications that are coming through, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody's getting scores. Right, we know what they're doing. It's like you do these things to get the points, and the bottom line. Let's put another line on there. So I don't know exactly what it is, but that we are thinking intersectionally in terms of how this happens, and so that again, housing and transportation and park policy. Because water policy and land use, like, y'all are always there. We're Minnesota. So you're not gonna get that
It's kind of like how we added the equity toolkit stuff to evaluating our long-term plans. So be adding an outdoor access toolkit to our other areas.
But I want to really bake it in there. I don't know how we do it and get guidance on that, but I do. I'm just saying in terms of the things, because what happens is, Sue, you're right. We're talking about things that need money. Like, in the end, right, if we could buses out to the park. Do it, you know what I mean? You know what I mean? So I think in the end, it always is dollars. It's always dollars in the end. And how do we use the scale? And that's what that when we look at some of the projects that are coming, we're trying to figure out how do we put what is typically seen as community development in the scale of transportation planning, right? Because even from a community development perspective, right? Transportation money is big, big money, right? And so I'm just saying that is this the way we talk about intersectionality in a new way? That it is literally in there so that it's measurable in terms of outcomes and actions, that the dollars themselves is in the scale of the big projects we do, so that we don't think $8 million is a lot of money. It is, when you start looking at transportation dollars, you get bored with $8 million, people. I'm just like,
well, and basically a big part of what you're saying is if you spend $1 and it fulfills 2 goals, you had $2. So how can we make sure that the dollars we're spending are fulfilling multiple goals at the same time?
Mm-hmm.
How do we do it and talk about it in a real way that isn't an add-on? It's not us going, it'd be really great if it. Really get at this idea of where there really are shared goals and objectives, because parks, connection to outdoors, whatever those things are integrally connected to scale, and I think that is part of it. Just because in the end it always comes down to dollars and cents, and then we're always the last dollar. We're the extra dollar, and we want a checkbox at the bottom of the tax form. It's just. I think it would be really great for us to really look at the scale of dollars around transportation and housing. We do know that we've got to do this for equity. Like, that's the other thing, when we talk about equitable outcomes and that, you know, in terms of people living that first day of, we know not all people benefit from the region. Okay, we've done a lot of acknowledgement. Okay, we're good with that, right? But there is something we can do to put the you know, if it's equity is getting there. I think it's in every document that comes through here has, right? Is there something when we think about our systems, and our park system is one of those, that there is an equitable kind of participation of the systems within the larger funding that we do, so that we don't see them as separate, and we're not informing it, or, you know, these things. But if we really think about how parks, green space, outdoors, and these aspects fit into it, there is something fundamental about it. The other system is education, right? There's a really big dollar amount. You all deal with that less at Met Council, you know?
But not.
You know, but again, in terms of, you know, it's something. And even with that, you know, the neighborhood schools are coming back in St. Paul. Anybody, you know, Minneapolis versus St. Paul is going to be interesting, because St. Paul is developing they want to get back to neighborhood schools, right?
Yeah. I do want to make sure we give some other people a chance to talk about some things too. We can come back to you if you have more. I saw Cecily next. And
Yeah, so this intersectionality is really interesting, but getting back to the values of parks, what I've yet to see in one of the Met Council plans is, how big do we want this system to be numerically? Like, I lived in the Bay Area. We were going for 2 million acres for the 9 counties. I've yet to see a goal for this 10 implementing agencies of acreage in the regional parks and mileage in the trail system. And maybe the implementing agencies in their agency master plan have this figure. You know, maybe it's rolled up from the different master plans, I don't know. But to me, I mean, why are we doing this otherwise?
Yeah, we have an amount that's approved, not necessarily built, but not
No, but aspirational.
But not a goal. Not
you know, I mean, again,
yeah.
2050 is near but far away. And, you know, if the agencies want to double their acreage, it's going to take money, and it's going to come from transportation, it's going to come from housing and all that great stuff, but we got to make the case for it.
Sure. Bob?
I'm going to make a suggestion. First of all, I think we're going to need to adjourn, or at least I'm going to have to adjourn.
Yeah, understood.
Myself in a few minutes. This stuff is important, and I'm not very interested in sticky notes either. But
Not very interested in, sticky notes, got it.
I do want to participate and think about this stuff, and I would be very willing to spend some time between now and the next meeting, or in a time defined by staff, to sit down at my computer and fill in the blanks for these various pieces and for your balloons. So I do want to participate, but I'm sorry, I'm going to have to leave shortly.
Yeah, it may be that if you give us homework, you'll get more focused.
Yeah, so if you send out some form that we can fill in, I would be happy to participate.
Okay.
But it won't be yellow and it won't be sticky.
I did think of a couple of things that tie into some of these other categories that I think might be what you're going for, and one of them ties in a bit to what Cecily was saying there. Across a combination of parks, land use, and housing, one thing we could say is we have our defined service areas for each of our parks. So one of our goals might be that X percentage of the population, whether it's 100 or something less, would be within the service area of a park and within the service area of a trail. And that goal might drive a little bit about what the goal for park acreage and trail miles might be. Because I don't know that those goals come out of nowhere. We don't just declare we want 2 million acres of parks. We have to say 2 million acres, why? Because that's what it takes to serve this amount of the population, and here's where we have to locate it. So, and it's probably on a per capita basis too.
It's kind of following President Biden's goal of 30 by 30. You know, it's what do we need, you know, in society now? What do we need in open space that's developed or undeveloped?
And another one I thought of that gets to a bit of the fringes of what the council's authority is, but between water and parks and also addressing a bit of our climate kind of stuff, I'm thinking like on the municipal level in our zoning code, I know we have a percentage of your lot that's allowed to be covered by impervious surface. So when we're talking about water quality and needing things to be able to filter through vegetation or, I'm blanking on the word, but like trickling down into aquifers to recharge, things like that. Should there be a regional goal for things like impervious surface or percentage that is tree covered and things like that? And obviously parks would be providing a significant portion of that, but not all of it. So it also goes into the individual community plans of, you also have your local parks that are also contributing to that number. And that ties into your community plan that comes up through the council and all these things. So could we have some kind of big picture numbers for certain natural system aspects where our regional park system is meeting a large percentage of that, but it's also tying into local systems, individual private properties? You know, I have a bunch of trees on my property. Is that getting counted for the council in something? We saw a couple years ago the presentation of how tree cover impacts a bunch of equity things in temperature and health and all that. How does that get counted in our goals for our development guide and things like that? Bob.
One other point that I just want to make. We don't, at least we haven't been given to my knowledge, any demographic information in terms of size of expected population by 2050, size of growth, size of ethnic and other kinds of older, younger characteristics of our population. Because we're sitting here talking about doing stuff, but an important part of this would be, are we going to have 5% or 10% kind of growth, or are we going to be kind of stagnant because we're raising taxes every year? So we need to have some kind of expectation from you all from the top of what the expected size and scope of our population will be in order to apply a smarter set of goals, I think.
And we saw some of the scenario planning from Dan of possibilities. We don't know which one's going to be which. So then it comes down to how do we write some of our parks related goals in a way that they automatically flex based on which one of those scenarios is actually happening.
Mr. Chair, we can share our 2050 regional forecast as well. Our staff just presented it to the council not that long ago, so we can share that with you.
Okay.
So you have that, which includes both the big picture as well as the demographics around age and ethnicity, race and ethnicity, and kind of the influencing factors of why certain things might be showing up.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to have that.
And employment as well.
Great. Okay.
Mr.
Yes,
Chair,
Sue.
before you adjourn, I want to just, this is a personal statement on my part, but I don't think of the council as top-down. My role is to listen and to reflect and to try and hear what everybody's saying and help influence the council's decisions based on what I learn from folks. So I don't want you to think that I think for some reason I'm on some higher level. So just to clarify. I drive the staff crazy because they want to call me Councilmember Bento and I tell them to call me Sue because I loathe titles. So. If I was the Queen of England, they'd be calling me Sue. But I'm full-blooded Irish, so I'll never be the Queen of England.
All right. Anyone else? Yeah, I'd agree with Bob that probably a certain amount of homework would be useful in this. And you might do some of it now, but especially once we get full appointments done, that would probably be a good time to revisit. If we do some of it now, we probably need to do it again later because it would be good to have the full representation later. Okay, we're moving on from that, sounds like. Thank you for tolerating us, yanking you all over the place.
Thank you. Despite the fact, I two points. I'm really glad we didn't bring sticky notes. It was
almost did. You were close.
I would have done it.
And
for punishment.
My expectations were actually exceeded in this meeting because this sure the bureaucratic language of how language comes together, like that's the language of an organization like this. But it also leads to action. And what I'm hearing from the bottom up is action should tell you what those big ideas should be.
Mm-hmm.
I heard intersectionality may very well be a core value of the council. And that's the first time I've heard that in any of these presentations we've done. So thank you for all your participation.
All right, thank you. All right, I'll move us on to our reports. We'll get these quickly. One that I alluded to is that the legislature did pass a redistricting plan for the Met Council, which means that today we are actually now all serving at large, and our terms have technically expired, but we serve until reappointed or replaced. Districts have changed a bit. There are a couple of our commissioners that I believe are impacted, but they're not here tonight. I think all of you stay in the districts you were in. The council itself is going to handle their own appointments first before coming through to the advisory committees. So we'll be seeing postings and reapply for our positions, re-interview for our positions, and so on coming up in the next few months. Be aware that that also changes what the terms are for some of these. That'll be a whole thing. But the biggest thing out of that is we are still going to be looking for applicants in E and H. But what E and H are slightly different now than they were before. So take a look at those maps and then rethink of whether you know anybody in either of those two districts. And when we do get around to posting things, try to get somebody to apply. Especially because we're working on the Parks Policy Plan update right now, I would really like to have a full complement of commissioners because it's so important to have all those different perspectives. So that would be very helpful. A little bit of update on other legislative actions. There was a lot of stuff that happened with money. You heard some of it in the O&M. A lot of it is relatively good news. Like we didn't get necessarily everything we want, but there's a lot of things that came through that are either increases from before or some one-time supplements for projects that were fell back. I'm not going to read through them all, but basically there's a substantial amount of good news in here. You know, legacy stuff is up, O&M stuff is up. There was both a bonding program and a cash bill that is kind of functioning like bonding, but came from slightly different sources of money. And I believe the council is still going to match it the way that they do with bonding. So there's a bunch of things there. I will say that I am still frustrated looking at those capital investment bills. There were still, again, earmarks pulled out for some of our implementing agencies for particular projects. Now, the legislature can do whatever they want. We have no power over them by any means, but when we're talking to our implementing agencies, I'm not sure how to deal with them doing that because it means that they're taking the money away from other implementing agencies that aren't doing that. So I don't know what we can do about that, but I just want to keep raising it every time it happens that I find that frustrating because we're supposed to have an organized program for capital investment, and every time we get an earmark, it damages that program. So that's a personal frustration, but the total amount of money is good news. I'm happy about that. There's a lot, you know, the programs that are being funded are great, and so that's going to be really nice. You know, but know that the $16 million number is not the full story. There is additional money happening that's going into parks that will do good things. It's just not going on the line item I wish it did, basically. Several of you probably got an invite. There's an event, sort of a ribbon cutting-ish thing for Ramsey County. Signage stuff coming up. There might have been another thing too, that I no longer remember what it was. So I'll leave that to anyone else to mention if you remember what it was. Other commissioner reports? Okay.
I wanted Anthony to just talk for a minute about the Phyllis Wheatley project that he and Carver County have been working on in Minneapolis.
All right.
Phyllis Wheatley, which is a North Minneapolis-based organization, they actually are celebrating their 100th year coming up here this year. They started out as a settlement house during the settlement house movement in America to actually help immigrants acclimate as they move to America and becoming citizens. And they had a very particular focus on the African American community moving to Minneapolis. in 1924. And so but they were gifted a camp by a board member, Catherine Parsons, I believe from Faribault, Minnesota, as a board member, and the camp was opened in 1957 and operated actively until 1999, probably 1998. And they have held this land for this last 25 years. Just the board didn't sell it, and all that's happening, and I think as communities engage outdoors, they have been working to reopen the camp. And so the camp is in Carver County, it's on Oak Lake, and it's been quite a journey because, if you can imagine, this community around there basically has had 100 and some acres of a backyard that no one was using. And so reactivating the camp means that they lose that 107 acres of backyard. And but it is a really small residential lake, and I think that the biggest thing, they've been really thoughtful. They've worked with the Land Conservancy. They've put about, what is it, 90 some acres in the Conservancy. They're going to be using a smaller plot for the camp right on the lake. They are in fundraising mode right now to really try to. We're going to do some programming this summer, starting with kind of like nature in the city, connected to Carver County. And one of the things that I kind of did was reached out to Marty at Carver County Parks to say, is there a collaboration for us? Is there something we do relative to Equity Outdoors that is about communities in North Minneapolis, connecting there, and programming and staff and all those things? And we were able to sit down with Marty and the kind of environmental education team that he has, they are amazing, and Carver County Schools. And so we're really looking at ways, they got interesting, is that if we do this right, we may actually serve more young people who live in Carver County, than young people who live in North Minneapolis, because the camp serving North Minneapolis kids is basically from June to September. And serving Carver County, of course, will be the rest of the year. One of the things we identified was that there is a lack of programming in West Carver County. And so kids and going to school at Carver County Elementary are literally driving to Medina or someplace. Like they're putting them on buses and taking them 30 miles away to go to programming, whereas this is 5 minutes or 6 minutes. It's just turned really interesting, and there was a tremendous amount of resistance from the community to get a conditional use permit to reopen the camp, and we have been fighting through that. Like that's been very interesting. And but they did receive their conditional use permit from Carver County, and so we'll be doing first programming in the summer of '24.
Wow, that's great. Sue, do you have anything?
Well, I was just going to mention that I believe it was yesterday or the day before, and I've shared this already with Emmett. I heard a portion of a radio interview with, and maybe you know, Anthony, who this is. I believe he has a nonprofit, and he's creating an opportunity for young people who've been victims of shootings to go to Three Rivers Park.
Mm-hmm.
And
Fargi. It's Fargi.
Yes. And I was really impressed with the portion. I didn't hear the entire thing, but the portion that I heard. And I thought that having that program in Three Rivers might make a great nudge for us some night.
Yeah.
When we're meeting. I think it has a lot of potential.
Okay. Staff updates.
I don't really have too much. I just wanted to reiterate what you said, Anthony, that at Keller Regional Park from 1 to 3 this Saturday, we are integrating parks and transportation, bringing a bus that is wrapped with some of the artwork that we helped fund. So that's one. That sounds like I was pandering. Okay. So it is going to be a really nice event, and it's going to be fun, and it will be artist driven. And so please come if you're interested, Nabel. Amanda, Chi, and others will be there to help support. I'll be there. So.
And where's it at?
It's at Keller.
Oh, at Keller, and what time?
Yeah.
The sameness about signage totally made people not want to go.
And changing ordinances.
You know what I mean? Ramsey
How
County
excited
signage.
does that
Who's
get?
excited about
I find signs and ordinances exciting, but I'm weird.
Yeah,
something
you're,
I'll admit that.
yeah, no. So, no, it's gonna be a nice celebration, and it is about art and the outdoors.
That's a much better title.
Okay, that all?
Yes,
All right,
thank you. I'll send information out to everyone if you want it.
then we'll go ahead and let you go. Thanks for sticking around, everybody.
Thanks
We're
for
adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.